Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another episode of Ships of War, the series in which I take historical warships, the famous, the not so famous and the downright notorious sometimes, and try to place them within their historical context, but not to do so in any excessive detail because the main purpose of this exercise is to look at these vessels in particular games that I happen to have in my collection, and really just to analyze how the game represents them and whether I think this is fair in relation to how they performed historically. Now, as you all know from long association, if you've been watching the series, I try to choose ships that were either direct combatants or could have fought each other. And today, my two special guests, I'm pleased to say, are the aircraft carriers HIJMS Zuikaku of the Imperial Japanese Navy and USS Enterprise of the US Navy. And today I am looking at these vessels as they appear in Tomoki Kondo's excellent card game Iron Bottom and Sunset Sky. Yes, I know. I've said elsewhere it's somewhat less poetic when you translate it from Japanese to English, but aficionados of Guadalcanal, I'm sure, will get the references. So this is quite an exciting episode for me because I have not done aircraft carriers yet, so these two special ships will be my first. Now, before I get going, just to remind you of the topography of the cards and what the information represents, if I borrow USS Enterprise here. So the number up there, top right, is the points value. So you score that number of victory points for sinking the ship. Those icons indicate how many aircraft cards the carrier can support. So you can attach 2 aircraft squadron cards to this card. That number there is the anti-aircraft rating. These 3 numbers here are not used for aircraft carriers because they are surface combat ratings and shore bombardment ratings. So just so you know, in order, they're surface gunnery, torpedo, shore bombardment. That's the ship's anti-submarine rating. That is its speed. And that is its strength, how many hits or greater you need to score to sink the vessel. So there we go. So I suppose I'd better start with why Zuikaku and Enterprise particularly. Well, it's partly selfish reasons. Both the Yorktown class, from which the Enterprise hails, and the Shokaku class, of which Zuikaku was the other member, are favourite classes of mine, and their stories are inextricably intertwined in the context of the Pacific War. Now, very interesting statistic about Zuikaku and Enterprise in particular is that until Zuikaku was sunk in October 1944 during the Leyte Gulf actions, I mean, really, they lived what you can almost describe as parallel lives. Not quite, but almost. So they both, rather weirdly, up to that point, took part in 6 major operations during the Pacific War and a myriad of smaller ones that roughly totals out at the same figure. So these 2 ships were as busy as each other. And of these 6 major operations, in 4 of them, they went head-to-head against each other. So the battles in question are the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, August 1942, the Battle of Santa Cruz, October 1942, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in the summer of 1944, and of course the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. So they were quite busy, and during some of these actions, they were literally hurling aircraft at each other. So this makes them a really interesting pair. The other thing is how weirdly similar they were. Now, both these ships were built in a sort of isolation from each other because, of course, once Japan renounced the naval limitation treaties in 1934, she very much went her own way. And when the Shokaku class were conceived, it was about 1936, and then they're finally authorized in the 1937 Fleet Replenishment Plan. So the Western powers don't really know what's going on in terms of Japanese aircraft carrier building. They're sort of dimly aware of Soryu and also of Hiryu, but the Shokaku class come as a complete surprise to them. And similarly, in a way, once the Japanese began playing unfriendly, although the US adopted a much more open policy about their shipbuilding than the Empire of Japan did, they were nonetheless very careful. They weren't idiots. They weren't going to let potential enemies snoop around. And so the Japanese, although they were aware of the broad specifics of the Yorktown class, they didn't know as much as they would like, and an awful lot of their information concerned the externals, really. In any case, because of the comparative dates as to when these ships come on stream, even if the Japanese had learned a lot about the Yorktowns, it would have been a bit too late to influence the design of the Shokakus. And to be perfectly honest, they probably wouldn't have bothered. They were fairly convinced of their own design philosophy. So these two ships enter service really close to each other. USS Enterprise is commissioned in 1938, and Zuikaku is completed for service in 1941, just months before the Pearl Harbor operation. So it's a very, very, very close operation. And I have some lovely, lovely photographs because I do like showing you all photographs. This is Enterprise as brand spanking new in 1938. And as you can see, she's so new. She's still got her first generation of aircraft on her decks, all these lovely biplanes that were very, very soon to be replaced by something a bit more sensible. Now, I say sensible, bearing in mind the next evolutionary step for the US Navy's carrier-borne fighters was actually the poor old Brewster Buffalo before they began graduating to Wildcats. But you can see some of the distinctive features of the ship. You know, she's long, she's fairly slim. She's got this very, very distinctive tall slab-sided funnel that's such an endearing part of this class and gives them such a wonderfully handsome profile. Now, the awesome appearance of this ship actually belies the fact that no one was particularly happy with this class when it was completed, and they were very much a compromise between different competing demands. So some elements within the design bureau wanted them to be proof against gunfire from cruisers. At the same time, they had to be the ideal sort of landing platform. So the aviators actually didn't want such an enormous superstructure. They wanted the sorts of folding funnels you had on its predecessor, USS Ranger. Now, of course, the problem is if you have properly protected machinery spaces and you want a certain degree of flight deck space, you can't have folding funnels. It's a bit of a luxury, and you need to think about your funnel trunking. And so the best that could be come up with as a compromise was this arrangement. But in the end, it actually worked really, really well. For all the uncertainty and bickering, of course, this went on to be one of the most successful classes of aircraft carrier the US Navy ever built. And they were, of course, the prototype for the highly successful Essex class carriers, which started coming on stream from 1943. Now, I'll just put that to one side for a second, and to keep things fair, let's have a quick look at Zuikaku. I'll just fold that down a bit. So, this is not quite as revealing a picture as that one of Enterprise, but you get the idea. She's very similar. She's got the same long, slim hull. Incidentally, Shokaku was significantly larger than Enterprise. Not that you would notice from distant aerial photos, but the similar length to The similar length to beam ratio belies the fact that Shokaku was a good 6,000 tons heavier than Enterprise, fully loaded. And that was for various reasons. Certain elements of the ship's machinery were heavier. She carried a somewhat heavier battery of guns, as we'll see later. Her armor distribution was a bit different, but not to the degree that would cause the ships to top out all that differently. But it was little extras that led to the different weight ratios. And it's surprising because when you look at Enterprise's very thick island superstructure, the one you find on the Shokaku class is really quite minimalistic, and this is a feature of Japanese carriers, particularly the generation which entered the war in the Pacific. Their aviation command and control facilities were way behind that of the United States. So the small island is a dead giveaway as to their limited capabilities. But in other respects, you can see the same sorts of things going on, the same kind of design philosophy. You can see gun tubs studding the side of the ship just below the level of the flight deck. And this is very similar to what you see on the Enterprise. In fact, it's almost uncanny how similar their design conclusions were. You can see there's Enterprise's forward 5-inch gun tubs, and there would have been smaller positions around the edge. You can see her other 5 inches right aft, but more clustered around the superstructure. That was a bit of an advantage, really. Their bigger superstructure let them build in more weapons, but at the cost of slightly cramped flight deck space amidships. So let's have a look at how these two compare with each other in the game. So what about Air Wing? Let's move down the card. So in effect, they've been given equal aircraft capacity. And I think this is right. The total aircraft capacity of the Zuikaku as completed was 84 aircraft. That was her absolute maximum. The equivalent total for USS Enterprise was actually 96. So despite her smaller dimensions, the US carrier could stuff more planes in. Now, this is partly a reflection of better US aircraft storage capability, and it's a direct result of their more modern aircraft having better folding wing arrangements than the Japanese. It made a huge difference to how many aircraft you could stuff into your carrier. Now, the thing to be careful is the numbers I've just fed you are are maximum stowage. The problem with maximum stowage is operationally you've got too many planes, and some of them, if they're not dismantled or got rid of in some other way to make room, they become a hindrance rather than an asset. And in service, although their operational totals varied quite a bit, if you look at 1942 in isolation, both aircraft carriers were routinely operating about 72 to 75 aircraft. That was the total they were comfortable with. And in both carriers, again, interestingly, the total ratio of fighters, it would be about 18 to 24 fighters, depending on time of the war and casualties and replacements, with the remainder being attack aircraft, bombers, dive bombers, that is, and torpedo planes. So that seems to be pretty fair, giving them an equal total there. Now, it's a peculiarity of this game that each carrier can only accommodate 2 cards. But if you look at the aircraft cards, and I'll shift these guys down a bit so you can see what I mean. A carrier at full complement really ought to have a combination of fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and yet the game forces you to choose 2 and not have the third one. Now, I find this really odd. I don't know what the reason for it is, and in some frustration, I've actually house ruled it that if you have a set of fighter, dive bomber, and torpedo plane, then you're allowed to exceed that capacity by 1. Of course, if you don't have this ratio, then you can't do it. Just because that's the way my mind works on this one, I'm afraid. Sorry. But yes, in terms of how fairly the game represents the ships, that is a that is a pretty fair statistic for them. They're basically evenly matched, is what I'm trying to say. So what about anti-aircraft capability? Because that's the next stat. Now, they've been rated equal here, and that's fine, but it's a tricky one, because if you look at the way the armament of the two ships evolved over the course of the war, Enterprise ends up with a very clear superiority. But as completed, the two are actually pretty equal. Now, Iron Bottom and Sunset Sky covers the period August 1942 to February 1943. So the ships actually begin with a parity, but there's no mechanism for upgunning the Enterprise over time. But of course, if the two, met as they did in August 1942 at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, then perhaps that is a fair rating. But what does that mean in terms of the historical numbers? Well, Enterprise was completed with 8 5-inch single anti-aircraft guns. She also had 4 quadruple 1.1-inch machine gun mountings. I mean, these were okay. They packed a heavy punch, but they had a tendency to jam. And crewmen for these guns often had a hammer and a chisel ready just in case they had to whack a stopped round out of the breech to get the gun going again. Weirdly, they were very popular weapons while they hung around. She also had 24 0.5-inch or 50 caliber single machine guns. So that's her starting armament in 1938. Now, in 1941, Zuikaku actually tops out a bit heavier than that. She has 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns, so surface and anti-aircraft role, and she has 42 of the Japanese Navy's 25mm rapid-fire machine gun, roughly equivalent in some respects to the Allied 20mm, but not actually as good. Let me elaborate on this. So, Shokaku, in terms of heavy AA, supposedly outguns Enterprise 2-1, but I'm going to bring the photo back. Look at how these are mounted on Enterprise. You've got single mounts, which have a good coverage. Neither carrier is capable of cross-deck firing, at least not very effectively, but they've got reasonable coverage for their weapons. But whereas Enterprises are single mounts, Zuikaku are dual mounts. So effectively you have guns paired on a single mounting. And what I'll do is, I've got a better photo somewhere that illustrates this. Here we go. That is a close-up of Zuikaku's dual heavy guns. So she's got twice the number of 5-inch guns, but they are dual-purpose mounts, which are slightly less effective than dedicated AA mounts. And even worse, because the guns are paired, it means the power of both guns are locked onto a single target. So effectively, when it comes to knocking aircraft down, Zuikaku possesses the same number of heavy guns as the Enterprise. The other thing is, in terms of range, her 25mm guns were, if anything, very slightly inferior to the US 1.1-inch machine guns. And their stopping power wasn't brilliant either. For some reason, the Japanese set great store by these weapons right up to the end of the war, but they simply were not that good. I know I said in my video previously about the Yamato that one of the really depressing things for the Japanese, even though they probably didn't know it at the time, was that the maximum range of the effective range of the 25mm gun was comfortably within the bomb release range of a Dauntless. So to put it another way, a Dauntless dive bomber could release its bomb with no fear of being taken down by one of these things unless it was a lucky hit. And at those distances, it wouldn't really matter anyway. So all things considered, it's probably a fair rating, but really the US carrier should have a bit of an edge. I would actually be tempted to either, because most Japanese ships in this game quite rightly have an anti-aircraft rating of 0, Zuikaku probably should be bumped down to a 0. And then that keeps things steady because most US ships have an anti-aircraft rating of 1. So I won't bother with these other ratings because, quite frankly, neither carrier had any business getting into a surface engagement. And that's realistically portrayed because even though Zuikaku's 5-inch are dual-purpose guns, no one's seriously expecting you to use them. Similarly, the ship's intrinsic anti-submarine warfare rating is 0. This is right. Neither carrier was particularly equipped for anti-submarine work. It simply wasn't in their job description. That's what their escorts were for. Naturally, they could supply the aircraft for scouting around the fleet. But at the end of the day, it's the destroyers who have to keep the submarines down. Now, what about the speed rating? Because here Zuikaku's been given a clear advantage over the Enterprise with an abstracted rating of 5 over 4. Now, in Iron Bottom and Sunset Sky, the only purpose that speed serves in the naval context is to dictate whether a player is able to disengage or not. And this can be a significant advantage. You can't disengage from an air attack, but if you're caught on the surface, the player with the higher speed rating can decide whether to retreat or stick around. Now, to be perfectly honest, the chances of your carriers getting caught in a surface engagement are minimal. This game doesn't stop you doing it, but you have to be quite a dummy to let surface ships get that close. But why is Zuikaku so much faster? Well, as completed, Enterprise was capable of reaching a maximum speed of 32.5 knots. That was her rated maximum speed, and she performed it quite well. Her machinery stood up to it, but most of the time her maximum throughout the war hovered at about 30. And she did become a bit slower after she was bulged in the mid-war period to try and give her some stability back when her AA armament began thickening. In fact, the bulging increased her beam from 83 foot to 109 foot. So that was a significant amount of weight she put on. So it's not surprising her speed suffered a little bit. Now, as completed, Zuikaku was capable of 34.2 knots. And she did manage this comfortably on her measured mile and her early service. But again, like Enterprise, over time, she had a very hard war. Maintenance cycles weren't what they should have been. And in the second, second year of her wartime life, late 1942, her speed had also deteriorated to around the 30-knot mark. And it was a speed she could maintain very comfortably for long periods, but neither one really hit their totals very often. And even going to battle speed, you'd be looking at them hovering around the 30-knot mark. So again, I would question that rating. I think that if Enterprise is going to be a 4, then really Zuikaku should be a 4. Or alternatively, bump Enterprise up to a 5. So that brings me to our very last rating, the survivability, how much damage both ships can eat. Now, it's probably worth looking at how much damage these two battered prize fighters took over the course of the war, because it was quite significant. Now, with the Shokaku class, it's probably more instructive to look at Shokaku because she had quite a battering, and she took roughly the same number of hits over the course of her life than Enterprise did. I'll go into that in a moment. Zuikaku, by contrast, had a very charmed life and was not directly damaged until the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944. So what happened to poor old Enterprise? So she is around at Pearl Harbor. She's not actually in Pearl Harbor, obviously, but during the attempt to find the Japanese fleet, there's no success there. She participates in the Doolittle raid. She misses Coral Sea, but she fights at Midway. In all these battles, she suffers no actual damage, and by that I mean, direct hits or near misses from bombs. She doesn't get any of that. Come the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, she takes 3 direct bomb hits and 4 near misses, and they make a mess of her. But she's fairly rapidly repaired. It only takes a couple of months in the States, and she's back in the Solomon Islands just in time for Santa Cruz in late 1942. And barely has the poor carrier come back into service when she's hit again at Santa Cruz, and there's a picture of her, which I think this is Santa Cruz, where she's hit by 2 bombs and suffers 2 near misses, which, if anything, actually damage her a bit more severely than she was damaged at Eastern Solomons. So by this point, she's a bit of a battered carrier. So although it's a strategic victory of sorts for the United States Navy, the Enterprise staggers away from Santa Cruz feeling very, very painful. She goes on to much glory, getting through the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. She doesn't take any damage at Leyte Gulf, but she suffers more agony during the Okinawa campaign, where she takes a bomb hit and 2 separate kamikaze attacks. And the damage from those, cumulatively enough, was to keep her out of the rest of the war. But she almost made it all the way through. Now, Zuikaku, I said, had lived a charmed life until Philippine Sea, and that's right. She suffers 1 bomb hit and a near miss at the Philippine Sea, the battle which incidentally claims her sister, Shokaku. But she comes to grief at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and she absorbs a very impressive 7 torpedoes and 9 bombs before she sinks. And there's just to keep things fair, we had an Enterprise damaged photo. So here is the Zuikaku photo. This is her at Leyte Gulf, maneuvering at high speed and sporting her rather unique disruptive deck camo pattern. Note the complete absence of planes on her deck. She never had that many for this operation. And that smoke is from her funnels, but there is some additional smoke, and she's probably already had some pain dished out to her. But yes, so she succumbs at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But, what was the protection scheme of these ships? So I think it tops out at about even. So the Enterprise was not given as much protection as her designers would have liked. But she had a fairly lengthy belt of side armor. This was the anti-cruiser protection, which was 4 inches at its thickest, tapering down to 2.5 inches elsewhere. Shokaku had a very thick belt, but it only covered her magazines and her machinery, and it was 6.5 inches over the magazine and about 1 and a bit over her machinery spaces. So thickest armor on the Zuikaku, but the coverage was greatly inferior to Enterprise. And what about deck armor? Again, Shokaku has this clear advantage in plating thickness. She's got 5 and a bit inches over her magazines and almost 4 inches over her machinery spaces. But again, this is limited armor covering very specific areas. Beyond that, her decks are entirely unprotected. Enterprise, by contrast, had greater coverage of deck armor, but it was only 1.5 inches. So really, it was armor, but it wasn't, its stopping power was not amazing. One advantage Enterprise did have, which Zuikaku did not, was that she possessed armored bulkheads designed strategically around the ship's vulnerable spaces, and these were 4 inches thick. Zuikaku had nothing like that in terms of her bulkheads, and this was a significant advantage for the US ship. Now, the Enterprise's armor was never upgraded over the course of the war, but then neither was Zuikaku's, and in fact the only concession she has is that after Midway, the airspaces around her aviation fuel stowage were filled in with concrete to basically help her avoid the fate that that had overtaken the other Japanese carriers at that battle. So, in effect, I suppose in the context of the Guadalcanal campaign, maybe Zuikaku would have had a slight advantage in protection, but if she did, it was very, very slight. Given that this game doesn't go to the nth degree in terms of granularity and in terms of overall survivability, if you ignore the US superiority in damage control, which is actually dealt with by an event card in this game, then giving them an equal base rating is, I think, fair. So I think that's pretty much it. We've covered the aircraft cards. I mean, we've covered the carrier cards. If anyone's interested, I could line up their aircraft for their different air wings so you can see what's what. Because I suppose, in a sense, it's rather important to know what a carrier's going to be chucking off her flight deck. So let's put the fighters together, the torpedo bombers together, and the dive bombers together. So these aircraft, the US Wildcat, the TBF torpedo bomber, and the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, and their equivalents, the famous Japanese A6M Zero, the B5N Kate, and the D3A Val. These were their mainstay aircraft for most of 1942. And I won't go into too much detail of what all the ratings mean, because this is really about the ships at the end of the day. But just so you know, the Wildcats are rated a bit inferior in air-to-air combat, but they have an advantage in ground attack. The two sides torpedo bombers break even, as do their dive bombers, except the Dauntlesses quite rightly are given a better reconnaissance ability than their Japanese opposite numbers. Aircraft toughness isn't really a thing in this game, so interestingly enough, it does give the Japanese a slight advantage. But then the US has a corresponding advantage in numbers built in. Over time, their strength gradually increases, while that of the Japanese doesn't go up so much. So, in a way, if I could sum up the aircraft in this game, the US has slightly more staying power and the Japanese have slightly more offensive punch. That's a very debatable point, but I think it flattens out pretty well. So overall, just to conclude, I think that this game does represent the two ships very, very well indeed. The only things I would question would be perhaps the equality in the anti-aircraft and also Zuikaku's speed advantage over Enterprise. But otherwise, I think the game has done a very good job in modelling them. And I'm afraid it's out of print, this game, but it's well worth a try if you ever get the chance to. And in case you're wondering, I do not understand Japanese and I can't read katakana. The game designer and Google Translate were immensely helpful to me here. But I shall wrap this one up there. I really hope you've enjoyed this, and thank you so much for following this series. If it's your first video of the series, if you're new to my channel, please do check out the other episodes of Ships of War. I hope you find them interesting. If you're one of my regulars, as I say, I really hope you have enjoyed this latest episode of Ships of War. Thank you for your continuing support and your company. It's always good to have you guys on board. I really love getting the comments, and as always, I try and answer them as soon as I can. But thank you so much. Whatever has brought you to the channel today, it's really awesome to see you, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Take care, and thanks for tuning in. Bye.